各位朋友你好，我是史东。今天在节目中呢，为你请到的是一位非常杰出的一位智库型的人士。那么这位人士呢，他的原名，他的名字叫做 Parag Khanna。我现在在这儿很快把他的简历呢向您介绍一下。他有个中文名字叫做康世和，他是一位全球战略的学者，他也是一位环球的旅行家。那么他另外呢也是一位畅销书的作家。在今天节目中呢，我们专注的会为您介绍和他谈的是他最新的2本新书的一些内容，以及在这个书之中呢他所阐述的一些概念。布拉格呢，他被《时尚先生》这本杂志呢评为21世纪最有影响力的75个人物之一。同时呢，他也被当年的《连线》杂志列入为年度的聪明人的名单。他的本科和他的硕士学位呢是来自美国的 Georgetown University 乔治城大学的外交学院。他的博士学位呢是受颁于伦敦政治经济学院。到目前为止，他的足迹已经遍布了全世界各大洲的100多个国家。同时呢，他也被 Davos 世界经济论坛呢评为世界全球的青年领袖。我们现在就把他带入我们的画面之中。Parag, thank you very much for coming to the show.
Hello, Jay. Very nice to be with you.
Let's talk about the 2 books. Let's talk about the first book, Connectography. Tell us, what is that?
Sure. In many languages, there is not even a word for connectivity, which is really the foundational subject of the book. The idea that connectivity is not just a concept, it's a very physical thing. On top of that, I have fused the word connectivity with the word geography to create a new word, connectography, the geography of connectivity. And that means infrastructural connectivity like roads and railways and transportation systems, pipelines and electricity grids, which is our energy systems, and of course, internet cables and satellites, our communications systems. And those are all fixed physical infrastructures, and they enable our human connectivity. Except for 2 people sitting together in the same room, all connectivity between human beings requires some kind of a physical infrastructure. You and I are using a lot of infrastructure right now to be able to have this live conversation thousands and thousands of miles apart. This is connectography. Us having this call is connectography. 2 human beings able to create a relationship on the other side of the planet Earth without ever meeting is connectography. And it represents, in many ways, the evolution of hundreds of thousands of years of human behavior from the time that mankind began wandering across the continents and colonizing the Earth. We have always been building more and more connectivity based on whatever technological capacity we have. Whether we're just using stones to build a road, or if we are laying down the most high-tech fiber optic cables on the sea, on the bottom of the ocean floor, in order to have high-speed, high-bandwidth, instantaneous communication, all of that is part of how connectography is a very human process. And I wrote this book that was published in 2016 to overcome the notion that the most sacred, the most important, the most fundamental lines on the maps that we hang on our walls, that we use to organize our minds and our activities as a species, the most fundamental lines on the map are not the political borders that divide us. The most important lines on the map are absolutely the lines of connectivity, the lines of infrastructure. And they tell us much more about how we relate to each other, how we deal with each other as people, as countries, as cities, as companies, as organizations, than borders do. And that's a recent phenomenon. It's something that's really unfolded over the last several generations. So the purpose of the book was to show that we are now well past that transition point, where actually connectivity matters more than borders. Borders matter a lot. I am a political geographer. It is my training to study and understand borders around the world. China, for example, has 14 neighbors. China has more international boundaries with more countries than any other country in the world. So that's a process that I study very, very carefully. I'm not dismissive of borders. I'm a student of borders. However, I'm also a student of what is called functional geography, which is how we use the world and the connectivity that we build in order to maximize and optimize our resources, our distribution of land, labor, and capital, which is really what economics is. All of that depends on connectivity. So I believe that this was, an attempt to make an original contribution to our understanding of how our human civilization is unfolding.
Having said all that, what do you think should be our takeaway? Basically, this is how I view what you just said. It's a reality. It's also a inevitability that we're going to be connected no matter where we are. What does it really mean to an average citizen of the world?
That's a fantastic question. It's a fundamental and philosophical, as well as a very real and intangible question that you're asking.
Yeah.
And I do make the case that this is as intrinsic as any tribal instinct that we think we have. It is every bit as innate, as human, as natural, to feel a desire to be connected to other people. And what we see now as we come upon a time in the very near future, we are basically there already, quite frankly, where every human being can pick up the phone and call any other human being in the world, so long as you know their phone number. That is where we have reached. And that process is only going to intensify because technology is geographically spreading. The cost of technology is coming down, so everyone has access to it. It's not just information technology, but it's also biotechnology, robotics, artificial intelligence. So we do have to, each one of us, to answer your question, every one of us has to anticipate that rising degree of connectivity, the scope of connectivity in terms of not just being communications, but everything else as well. And of course, the impact that's going to have on our lives as citizens, as consumers, and then prepare accordingly in terms of our skills, our education, our mobility, where we work. In that book, I talk about how one of us is actually an economic migrant. Now, of course, this is something that Chinese people know very well. There are hundreds of millions of Chinese economic migrants over the last 150 years that have spread out around the world. Each of us, every human being, is a potential economic migrant. One of the things that I document in the book is that there are more than 300 million people right now living outside of their country of origin. So that is about 1 in every 15 or 16 people on the planet has now left the country that they were born in. There has never been anywhere near a number that high in human history. So we are a human species that is on the move. Connectivity enables it. It changes our loyalties. It changes our potential, our possibilities. I write about how there's a shift in identity, or in a new layer of identity beyond the nation, the tribe, the ethnic group, the religion, and that is the supply chain. What is the economic sector that you work in? Who do you professionally relate to? You may feel more of a kinship with people on the other side of the world who are fellow doctors or athletes or professors, as you do to someone who lives next door to you. And that is something that connectivity has enabled.
So where do you see the world based on your thoughts and your concept, let's say 10 or even 20 years down the road, compared to the world as we know it today?
Oh, that's another great question, Jay. We tend to not do a very good job of anticipating the very near future. One of the things I write about, for example, is conflicts. There have been 8 major wars predicted since the end of the Cold War 28 years ago. And a lot of those wars involve Asian countries, China and Japan, South China Sea, India and Pakistan, and so forth. And those wars have not happened, thankfully, as a result of connectivity, a new calculation of incentives between countries, a new pragmatism, the desire to pursue economic ties over political rivalries and territorial rivalries. And yet there have been wars that have happened that we did not predict, such as between Russia and Ukraine, the collapse of Arab states in 2011 and beyond, and so forth. So we're not very good at predicting these, some of these individual specific events. But one of the sort of conclusions I have in the book is that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards connectivity. One thing is for sure, the world of 5 or 10 years from now will be more connected, more globalized, more distributed in power than ever before. One of the main areas where I have a sort of fundamental disagreement with other people in the scholarly community is the debate about how many powers there will be in the world, for example. For a lot of people, they're looking for a simplistic answer. First, it was Great Britain in the 19th century, then America in the 21st century. Therefore, it is logical that China will be the sole and dominant superpower in the 21st century. I dispute that entirely. And it's not because of my views on China. It's because of my views of how the global system is evolving. And the way the global system is evolving is not that one empire or power is discarded immediately and replaced by another one. That is a very oversimplified view of history. In fact, the way we are evolving is to move to a multipolar world where China is a superpower, America is a superpower, Europe is a superpower, India is rising as a power. In fact, we live for the first time in history at a time when every region of the world, every continent of the world matters significantly, and has growing ties with each other. Each of them has a voice. South America has a voice. Africa has a voice. So even the less powerful regions of the world actually matter. So it's far too oversimplified. Not only is it oversimplified, it's fundamentally wrong to believe that there will be one dominant power in the world. And I think what's most exciting about 21st century geopolitics is that we have never seen an era where we have so many powerful entities and powers in different parts of the world all operating at the same time. And I think every one of us, whether we are an American citizen or president, whether we're a European leader or whether we are Chinese, that we have to get used to this fact that everything is going to be based on reciprocity, on mutual understanding, on dialogue, on agreement, on compromise, because we truly live in a world where no one can actually dominate all the others. It will never happen. Right. And again, to me, it's urgent that we have that conversation now rather than when it's too late. Because historically, of course, when European powers have fought each other, they did so on the presumption that they could dominate a proximate neighbor who controlled a global empire. And therefore, in defeating that neighbor who was right next door, they would be able to expand their global reach and influence. But the geopolitics of Asia and of the world look very different from the 19th and 20th centuries. What we have, even just within Asia, is historically a very distributed set of civilizations that are quite far apart from each other and quite culturally remote from each other. Chinese and Indians don't know very much about each other. Japanese and Chinese don't necessarily understand each other. Then there are the Persian civilizations, the Russian civilization, which is quite Asian, actually. And in my new book about Asia, I emphasize that and explain it. The Turkic civilizations. Asia has almost always been multipolar. So Asians actually should have a much easier time appreciating the dynamic that I am describing than Westerners, because in European history, you have countries that are very close to each other, and there's actually the possibility that one could defeat the other. And of course, over the centuries, they have defeated and conquered each other. But not since the Mongols 700 or 800 years ago has a single Asian power actually dominated the genuine full breadth and swath of Asia. And I'm quite confident that's never really going to happen again. And therefore, again, it's important to emphasize that Asia is multipolar and the world is multipolar. Each power will have a significant degree of influence around the world in different ways, economic, military, and so forth, demographic, culturally as well. But none will dominate. I really do have to emphasize this over and over again because it is the most important geopolitical theme of the 21st century.
Do you think you are being a little bit too optimistic about this? Right now, as we speak, I can think of some countries don't believe in multipolar power structure.
Well, I mean, I would say that it's not about optimism or pessimism. I work in the field of geopolitical analysis. I don't bring emotions or sentiments into the equation. I use formulas and logic, and I compare policies, and I look at power structures. So my views are nothing different from what I try to objectively analyze as much as possible. So what people think, to me, is much less relevant than what they need to understand. And I work in that latter category. My goal is to make people understand these facts. Either they're going to learn it the hard way, or they're going to learn it by listening to me. You can choose.
So they're going to learn it sooner or later, I guess.
Absolutely. And again, whether it's America or whether it's China, again, the mere fact that two countries or two sets of leaders can believe opposite things in the same world obviously means that either one of them is wrong or both of them are wrong. And what I'm saying is that both of them are wrong.
Mm-hmm. How are you accepted when you travel around the world, when you talk about what you talk about today?
Well, it really depends. I mean, this book has been published several years ago. It continues to sell very, very widely. I'm very fortunate about that. It's been translated in many languages, many editions. It's being used by a lot of military strategists. I see defense departments using it, a lot of prime ministers, a lot of mayors, a lot of students. I have many objectives with books like this. Of course, for political and economic leaders, to shape their thinking about strategy, globalization, economics, geopolitics. That obviously is very significant to me. But I also see a huge uptake from the next generation of people, of scholars, of students who identify with the message of global connectivity as their instinct and about the emergence of global values that never existed before. But I'll tell you, Jay, in brief, I mean, there's really hardly a country in the world where I have not received messages or been invited or directly traveled to meet with very, very senior political, economic, and intellectual leaders to discuss this theme. And the book has been very widely received, either because people agree with it or because they feel the analysis is so relevant to shifting how they operate and think about the world. Remember, one of the prevailing narratives right now is that globalization is in crisis. Globalization is at risk. Globalization is retreating. That is completely false. It's false on every possible level, but people say it anyway. So I'm offering a factual antidote to misguided pessimism about globalization. Again, globalization rests on connectivity. Connectivity is flourishing at a scale that has never before been imagined in human history. It is defying every possible expectation about how rapidly we can build it. It's defied every pessimism about how quickly human beings would get connected to each other and embrace that connectivity. And it is flourishing as China expands, as India expands. The more powers you have in the world, the more globalization you will have because each of them is reaching out. Globalization is the sum total of all of our activities, and we're globalizing like never before. So one could attempt to generalize about some people's views, but from my experience as someone who travels for a living, who spends 90% of my time traveling and interacting with people at all levels of society, all over the world on every continent, I find that there's very few voices who actually disagree with what I'm saying. I think they're having a much more constructive conversation about what they're going to do about it.
The term globalism has came to my mind many times as I was preparing for this interview. And because if you watch different shows, talk with different people, the term globalism sometimes means something positive, sometimes means something negative. So to the point, if you ask me what that means, I don't know what that means anymore. So let me throw that question to you. What is your definition of globalism?
Jay, you would not be alone in feeling that there are too many definitions of this term. Right. As it happens, I wrote my PhD at the London School of Economics under the guidance and supervision of perhaps one of the great scholars of globalism. His name is David Held. He's a British academic. He is truly the foremost scholar of globalization and cosmopolitan theory and globalism, and he's very much alive and kicking to this day. And he would point out, as I do as well, the distinction between globalization and globalism. Globalization, of course, is the process of ever unfolding interconnections and exchange between human societies, whether it is cities, countries, companies, and so forth. And again, that process is irrefutably expanding. Globalism is something more ideational, which is the term we use for the realm of concepts, ideas, theories, norms, and so forth. And the construction of a global identity, global values, again, global regulations, norms, and laws, that would be considered globalism. And to the extent that, as I mentioned, and something that I try to document through survey research over looking at youth perspectives from around the world, rich countries, poor countries, north, south, east, west, over the past generation, is that you find that the more young people you speak to, and the younger people are, the more they identify with the values that you would associate with the term globalism: environmental sustainability, the right to mobility, human rights and the right to free speech, and so forth. And so if you were to say there is something called globalism today, you would associate it with those values. And again, we can document through people's feelings that we survey and assess the extent to which more and more people in the world, more and more of humanity, subscribes to what you would call globalism or global values.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of things I would like to go over with you. For instance, I saw you wrote some articles about the U.S.-Chinese trade conflict.
Quite a few, in fact.
Yeah. So give us your take about this issue, because people will be very, very interested to know.
Of course. Again, the book Connectography is very much about this idea of tug of war, right? We have this connectivity, but that doesn't mean the world is peaceful. This is a book that's very much about geopolitics. But the new geopolitics beyond the traditional territorial competition is the competition to gain the most value from connectivity, which means supply chains, value chains, trade and investment patterns and flows. So a trade war of any kind is a perfect example of a tug of war, which is what connectography is all about. The US-China trade war is very much in line with that. It's a microcosm of it. It's a big microcosm of it, but that's precisely what it is. Nothing more and nothing less. Mm-hmm. It is something that China has been doing for exactly 40 years, which is using foreign investment, technology transfer, its own industrial policies to modernize its economy and rise up the value chain and capture ever more of the share of industrial production, to also gain ever more of the value and share of advanced technologies. The process began decades ago, and it's accelerating today with initiatives such as Made in China 2025. The United States' response to that is to try to slow that down. Not to slow it down necessarily, well, in several ways. One, by restricting the outflow of technologies into the Chinese value chain, and another is by demanding reciprocal market access so that American firms will have an even larger profit share in Asia than they have already enjoyed in recent decades. And that is exactly, in a very nuts and bolts, objective formulation, what is happening right now. So this is a war, but it's a tug of war over the value of connectivity. And it's been going on for a long time. It long predates the Trump administration, and long after Trump is gone and long after Xi Jinping is gone, there will be a global tug of war. It involves Europe, it involves other Asian countries, it involves oil producers as well. Part of the global tug of war is about displacing traditional hydrocarbon energy with alternative fuels. If you are a solar or a manufacturer in Germany, or if you make wind farms in Denmark, you are in a tug of war versus Saudi Arabia, because you are competing to provide an energy supply or source to your citizens and your customers around the world that will displace their demand for Saudi Arabian oil, right? So every sector of the economy, every possible product or service is part of a global tug of war that is perpetually playing out day and night, while you're awake, while you're asleep. So the only question is, does your country have a strategy in that tug of war, or do you not have a strategy? And is your strategy working, or is it not working? China's strategy has worked extraordinarily well, of course, in recent decades. The question is, has it reached what you would call an escape velocity? Can China now indigenously, internally innovate to such a degree, scale, and pace that it does not need to import foreign technologies that may be cut off to it? And my answer in my analysis is yes, because it doesn't have to just invent things on its own. There's just about everything that it does buy from the United States in the high-tech area, specific categories of semiconductors or microchips or software. If it cannot get them from America, and by the way, it is still getting them from America, but even if it could not, it can get them from Japan, it can get them from South Korea, it can get them from Taiwan, it can get them from Germany. And those countries have a very important role in this trade war, because it's not really a two-way tug of war. As I said, it's a multi-directional tug of war. And those countries are very willing to sell those products, as sophisticated as they are, to China, especially if the U.S. is not going to, because they want to continue to gain that market access and market share at America's expense. So I have a very clear prediction about how this trade war will play out, and it's a prediction that's based on what would happen even if no trade war ever broke out, which is that technology diffuses, and technology diffuses faster and faster with every generation of technology. It's not something that America can stop. It's not something that anyone can stop. It's as unstoppable as the internet itself. So to me, there's no question that it's not about a winner or a loser per se. It's about relative gains in being the principal supplier to the largest markets and in gaining the maximum profits from selling that technology. And so I think that there will be distributed winners, distributed sort of gains more and more over time. And so I think the Trump administration's policies are very misguided because they do much more to hurt American business than to help it.
Why do you think the United States government or the United States should learn from this experience, and what do you think the Chinese government should learn from this experience?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I'm really glad that you phrased it that way. I mean, the U.S. should learn that it cannot cut off or stop globalization, and it also cannot, interfere too much in its own company's interests.
What if they do?
Well, they are. They're already trying.
Yeah, I know. But what would be the consequences to come, as you can see it?
Exactly. It's not a hypothetical, Jay, of course. You're asking a very relevant and timely question. And what is happening is that American companies are actually pressuring back. They're pushing back against the Trump administration and saying, if you don't let us sell into China, then the next time Chinese mobile handset companies and airlines are purchasing their chips and their components and their airplanes, they're not going to buy from America. They're going to buy from Europe. And then we're going to lose very significant market value, market share, profits, revenues, and so forth. So they're really pushing back very hard. And the next thing that they'll do is to offshore themselves. They will relocate their companies' operations to Hong Kong, to Singapore, to places where they can cease to be American companies in order to have better access and not be vulnerable to the political risks associated with the Trump administration that's trying to reduce their business. So there are many things that will happen and many things that American companies themselves will do. Also, of course, they're going to learn that they are being substituted, right? They are being cut off. Again, any two countries in the world can trade with any other two countries in the world. No one is sitting at the center of the system and stopping it. Even Iran has proved very difficult to isolate. Look at its history, its geography, sitting at the heart of the ancient Silk Roads. It's nearly impossible to isolate Iran. You cannot isolate China. It is the largest trading power in the entire world. How can a country with a less significant role in global trade isolate a country at the center of global trade? It makes no sense. So they will learn. But let's be clear, China will also learn lessons. China will learn reciprocity. Reciprocity is the most important word in diplomacy. It's the most important word in international law. It's the most important word in global trade. You can't have rules without mutual acceptance and recognition and adherence and compliance with rules. And China has traditionally in the last several decades gotten away with one set of rules for others and one set of rules for itself. And that is what developing countries do. I want to be absolutely clear. I have written a lot, as have many others, about how industrial policy, import substitution, these are the practices of rising empires going back centuries. Britain did it. America did it. America would not be a superpower today if it were not for the import substitution policies of Alexander Hamilton, right? So let's be clear that every power does it, and China has done it. And of course it's done it. It's the logical thing to do for a developing country. And now other countries like India are copying the Chinese model. They are saying, if you want to sell your products in India, you have to make them in India. You have to transfer technology here. You have to use local joint ventures. Even democratic countries are doing the same thing. So we have to be clear that this is perfectly natural. But then when you become a global trading power, as China is, and you want to have your goods have access to everyone's market in the world, you also have to practice that reciprocity and open up your markets more as well. And that is something that hopefully, as we witness the most recent signals coming out of the trade dialogues that are ongoing, that is something that China will do. Now, there are sectors where China has been quite open, right? Automobiles, agriculture, electronics, and so forth, right? It's not that China has been a one-way street. Not at all. We have to be very fair and appreciate that China has benefited greatly from globalization and contributed greatly to globalization. But now there does have to be, again, reciprocity. I'm not saying this in a way that applies only to China. Not at all. It does apply to absolutely everyone. I speak about universal laws in many ways. And reciprocity, like connectivity, is something that's deeper than whether it's the American perspective or the Chinese perspective. We don't have a system if we don't have reciprocity. So I expect China to appreciate it every bit as much as I expect America or Europe or everyone else to appreciate it.
I would like to address another issue that is getting a lot of people's attention, which is the Yellow Vest movement in France. I'm not even sure this is related to what we're talking about right now, but being who you are, I definitely think you have a lot of thoughts about this you can share with us.
Sure, without a doubt. The so-called anti-globalization movements, anti-austerity movements, the inequality debates, and the violence that is stemming from the rise of domestic income inequality is a very big theme in connectography, actually, because, of course, what connectivity and urbanization do is to empower those people that are the most connected to profit more rapidly than those at the bottom of the industrial or value chain. So the Yellow Vest movement is one example of that. What I want to make absolutely clear is that these are not anti-globalization movements. These, like Brexit itself, Brexit, Yellow Vests, populism in America and Trump supporters, they may say they're anti-globalization because Trump tells them to be anti-globalization, right? Or Brexit, the Brexit leaders said this is, because we need to control globalization or reject some aspects of globalization. I want to be very, very clear, Jay, to you, to your listeners, they are lying, right? They are lying. The reason they are lying is because, of course, in politics, you want to blame someone else other than yourself. That is how you get elected. The fact is that globalization is not what is at fault here. What is at fault here is bad governance. Trump got elected because the governments before him did not harness globalization in an equitable way for their societies. The Brexit happened because the British government in London did not distribute the national benefits that country enjoys from globalization in an unequal way. Trump is an anti-Washington vote. Brexit is an anti-London vote. There is no anti-globalization whatsoever about this, even though that may be what people are saying from morning till evening. The fact is that they have benefited from globalization. Everyone benefits from globalization. The question is how much and how well does your government distribute those benefits? If you are unhappy with how your government has managed globalization, you should overthrow that government, right? You should overthrow it. I have a lot of sympathy for people sitting in Detroit who may have voted for Donald Trump. Right? Decades of governments in Washington did not do trade adjustment assistance sufficiently, did not help them find new jobs when their jobs were outsourced to China and Asia, and therefore they feel that they are disenfranchised and cut off. The fault lies with ourselves, with our governments, with our policies, with our citizenry. Do not blame others for mistakes that you have made. And so whatever Macron is facing with the Yellow Vests, whatever America is facing with its political divides between populists and so forth, it has to do with the failures of domestic policy. And I suggest that governments get their house in order and stop blaming everyone else for their own mistakes.
Let's say if Macron comes to you and says, what should I do? What kind of suggestion would you give him?
Well, here's the thing. It's not just Macron's problem, right? This is decades of accumulated overspending, very overly regulated sectors of the economy, protection of special interests in labor. There have to be a lot of reforms that Macron has wanted to do, and he's having a harder time doing it because of the accumulated inequality and frustration that began with the rising costs of maintaining the welfare state before the financial crisis, and it became worse after the financial crisis. So he's trying to do things that might be correct and very ambitious and necessary, but at perhaps the worst possible time. So that's the dilemma that he and, quite frankly, other European leaders face. Let me remind everyone, though, that the modern European social party, social democratic, multi-party parliamentary welfare state is the highest form of governance that exists in the world. Right? It is the most moral, the most equitable, the most egalitarian, the most democratic system that we have in the world today. We should not throw it away. It should not be replaced with fascism, populism, nationalism for the sake of it. And so I think that we need to have a much more kind of incremental strategy for countries like France, where they agree what is in their collective interest, rather than only what is in the interest of a specific category of labor unions or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if your Chinese friend had told you about this very famous Chinese way of thinking or talking. I don't know how many thousand years ago, there's a Chinese saying, talking about from a ruler's, from an emperor's perspective, poverty is bad, but it's not the worst. The worst is the inequality in the society.
Yes and no. So, leaving aside the proverb, I think that China is an example of how actually poverty is worse than inequality, because right. China has very significant inequality, but it has massively reduced poverty, and it has become a better country as a result. Mm-hmm. So actually, one of the fundamental debates in the world today is what matters more, poverty or inequality. There are, of course, many people who focus on inequality. I do not. I am in the other category. Mm-hmm. I believe poverty is a much bigger problem than inequality. And if you want to address inequality, if you want to reduce inequality, you can do two things. You can talk about it all day long, or you can focus on poverty. If you focus on poverty, you will actually reduce inequality. So I am radically in the camp of people who believes that we should expand connectivity, invest in infrastructure, invest in education, diversify economies, and that will reduce poverty and therefore it will reduce inequality. So there's no question in my mind that, like China of the last 40 years, we need to think much more about poverty and less about inequality. Of course, inequality matters because it has many consequences politically in terms of who controls power and decision making, and we have to address those things. But if you're talking about the day-to-day life of billions of people all over the world, there's no question that what matters more to them is poverty rather than inequality. So I put myself very firmly on the side of billions of people who are suffering from poverty and say that all of those who are talking about inequality need to spend a day in their shoes to realize what matters more.
My understanding about the poverty and equality is that the opportunity to get ahead, that is what I'm talking about. That's what I think the proverb was referring to. And
well, that is more equity than equality.
Yeah.
You're rightly referring, again, to inequality of access to public services and to rights and freedoms and influence.
Yeah.
And we should have equitable societies, right? We should strive for a system where whether you are rich or poor, mm-hmm. you have equal access to education, to infrastructure, to housing, all of these things. And I'm radically a believer in having more equity in societies. I do not believe in unfair advantages or unearned privilege, the way, of course, certain elites enjoy and might even defend. Mm-hmm. But that is a different conversation at this point in time when you think about a world of such high economic inequality than the one that we have to focus on when it comes to how to improve the day-to-day lives of many, many people. It's a political process, an economic process, a social process. It's much more complicated than even what I said earlier, which is, build lots of roads. But of course, how about that for another Chinese proverb? If you want to produce prosperity, build a road.
Right.
And so I think that is something that we do need to remind ourselves.
Uh-huh. Moving on to your next book, The Future is Asian. Why? Why make you...
Well, Jay, it's kind of funny. I was thinking of calling the book The Present is Asian.
Okay.
But that isn't quite as catchy as The Future is Asian.
Okay.
However, both statements are equally true. Because we do live in a world that is Asian, as you know. There are about 5 billion Asians in the world living in the geographical region, mega region of Asia.
Mhm.
And one of the purposes of this book is to chronicle and document the evolution, and particularly the last 20 years, of how Asia is Asianizing. Asia is reconnecting through the ancient Silk Roads and the restoration of those patterns of commerce and conflict and culture that have characterized Asian relations for thousands of years, all the way from the West Asian Arab states of the Gulf region, all the way to China, Japan, Korea, all the way north to Russia and south to Australia. And of those 5 billion people, only 1.5 billion are Chinese. Now, of course, there are a lot of Chinese people. It is the most populous country in the world. But there's also now an equal number of Indian people. There are 750 million people of Southeast Asia. So Asia has many very large demographic concentrations, and all of them are reconnecting with each other. And the story of Asia, rediscovering Asia, is one of the central themes in this book. So China is a big part of the book, but China is not the only part of the book. So not only did I want to write this book so that the world would understand the greater geography and culture and societies of Asia, not just China, because there have been many books about China. It's also useful for Chinese people to understand this greater Asia. Because, Jay, it has been 500 years since Asians had more intense dealings with each other than they have with the Western world, right? Colonialism and the Cold War were a 500-year process. Therefore, neither you nor I, no one alive today, has any memory of what that world was like when Asia had more to do with Asia than with others.
Mhm.
And yet we live in that world today, Jay, by all of the economic indicators and diplomatic instruments that I have studied and I document in this book through the stories that I tell. We already live in a world where Asia is rapidly Asianizing. But what has been slow to catch up is our mentality. Right? We still are accustomed to ancient or sort of, archaic or outdated terminology.
Programmed that way.
Right. For example, the Middle East. We use the term Middle East, but it's a 19th century artifact from a world in which Britain was a global empire. Today, England can't even sort itself out and is falling apart. But we still use the term Middle East. But of course, the Middle East is actually West Asia, right? To use another. Then when people talk about Asia and write about Asia, they tend to only be talking about China. But of course, again, there's more than 40 countries in Asia and 5 billion people. So telling this greater Asian story was absolutely imperative. And I wrote this book so that the world would understand Asia, but also I want Asians to understand Asians. When the Chinese read the Chinese edition of this book, they will learn more about Central Asia and the Turkic civilizations. They will learn about Pakistan. They will learn about India. They will learn about Russia. They will learn about their neighbors. And it's been centuries since they had those intense dealings with them, and they're rediscovering it now. The same is true for every other pair of relationships. Russians will read it and learn about Malaysians, and Pakistanis will read it and learn about Japanese. And that was the purpose of this book.
Sounds like you're doing the deprogramming process to deprogram all the Eurocentric or US-centric point of view.
Well, it is important to issue a corrective against a US-centric point of view. Again, to go back to what I said earlier, America in particular and North America as a continent remain one of the fundamental superpower regions of the world. I have no doubt about it. And no one should mischaracterize my views as diminishing North America's foundational role in global order. I have always believed it and written very, very clearly about it. However, what has been underanalyzed is the integration of Asia through these processes of regionalization and the new Silk Roads, the Belt and Road Initiative, the energy trade, all of these things that have been underanalyzed. And it's important to elevate those and give them the prominence they deserve, especially when you're talking about more than half of the world's population.
I'm sure you heard of this saying, especially from your friends from China, says the 21st century is the century of Chinese. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I think we almost answered that question earlier when we were talking about the geopolitical landscape.
Right.
Chinese may think it's the Chinese century. Americans may think it will still be the American century.
Right.
Indians may think it's the Indian century. And I want to say very categorically, every one of those is wrong. It's a global civilization. It's a global century. To the extent that there is a change in the relative position of America or Europe or of Asia, it's clear that it is going to be more an Asian century than the last century was or the century before that. So we should say it's an Asian century. Now, on the distinction between the Chinese century and the Asian century, that is, of course, a very big theme in this book. Mm-hmm. What China is learning through the Belt and Road process is that just because it is underwriting and financing all of these infrastructures for the rest of Asia, it does not mean that it will dominate those countries. Rather, what is happening is that it is helping those countries to modernize, to gain confidence, to diversify their sources of investment, to trade with more countries in their own region, with China and beyond, with the world. And like colonialism centuries ago, what happens when you develop your periphery and you develop your colonies is that they actually gain the confidence to resist you. So Belt and Road actually does not promote Chinese hegemony. Belt and Road promotes the return to multipolarity in Asia. And that is definitely the most counterintuitive geopolitical conclusion of this book. But it's also one that is by far the most consistent with history. Because if the actions of colonial powers only promoted colonialism, then the British Empire would still be alive today. The fact is that embedded within the process of investing in your neighbors, your smaller, weaker, post-colonial, post-Soviet neighbors, embedded in that process is actually elevating them and uplifting them and giving them the tools to resist you. So China is going to learn very quickly, China is learning very quickly that Asia is multipolar and the world is multipolar. So again, Jay, just to emphasize, what some people think and what is the fundamental reality that I observe are different things. And that's okay. It's important that I provide that analysis for exactly that reason.
When will this book come out? The Future is Asian.
So The Future is Asian is, I think, appropriately already out in some parts of Asia.
Okay.
The American publisher has kindly allowed for distribution in Singapore and in Malaysia and elsewhere, so it's already available. The main, sort of flagship launches will be throughout the course of mid-January in Singapore, and then carrying on to London, and then to the United States in the very beginning of February. So it's really a rolling process that has already begun, but from January onwards, the English edition is already out, and the other languages will be following one by one over the course of 2019.
Are you begin to promote this book yet? Are you traveling around to talk about this book yet?
I will begin that process officially in the beginning of 2019 with some large events at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore and at the World Economic Forum in Davos and so forth.
I'm very interested to know how people react to the subject of this book. Do you have a sense about it already?
So far, so good. The book has already received an extremely glowing review in the Financial Times, which is, of course, a very important sort of publication. They said the book is authoritative. They said it will become the standard reference on the subject of Asia. So I'm very, very pleased with that. They talk about this idea of the fusion of civilizations, in which, speaking about your earlier question, it's not really about one dominating the other, but returning to that process where Asians learn from each other. Other reviews in the literary world have also been extremely positive, and those are already now circulating on the internet. My goal is to provide a balanced analysis, one that reconciles the different perspectives and opinions and analyses that are out there. There are people that are US-centric. There are people that are China-centric. There are people that are focusing on the other parts of the world. It is my fundamental duty, as a scholar, as an intellectual, as an analyst, to reconcile all of those perspectives and try to come up with something that is proper, accurate, harmonious, balance among them. And that's what I hope that this book has done.
I take it when you talk about different dates of the availability of the book, it's the localized version. Am I correct in assuming that?
Well, the Mandarin edition, in terms of complex Chinese, the simplified Chinese, those are two different editions. They'll be available at different times, beginning in the late spring, so around April or May. The English edition, both the American and the British, because of course they have slightly different spellings and cover designs, those are both available in Hong Kong, Singapore, former Commonwealth countries, Australia, airports, bookstores around the world already. So I think your viewers in the month of January in particular will want to get the either of the English language editions.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I wish you nothing but the best. And I think personally, as a Chinese American, I think this book will be very, very important for a Chinese to read, to know where they stand historically in the world.
Of course, one of the most important parts of my process of promoting the book over the course of early next year will be to spend time in the United States with Asian American communities, such as your own, and to get their perspectives. There is a large section of the book about the Asianization of America over the last 150 years, looking very statistically at the population sizes of Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Filipino, and the many ways in which they have positively influenced American society. And I think that is going to be a really heartwarming and reflective and also very constructive conversation about what it means for American policies when it comes to immigration, for example, and education, and what American institutions can learn from the growing prominence of Asian culture and characteristics.
If you don't mind, Parag, I'd like to keep in touch with you.
Oh, we certainly must, Jay, and I look forward to meeting when I'm in the U.S.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.
Thank you.